I'm going to describe a scene and let's see if it's ever happened to you too. You're playing a game of chess. So far, everything's going fine. You're developing all your pieces normally, and it seems like there aren't any obvious tactical shots, right? And suddenly, you find yourself in big trouble. You're lost, you have no idea what to do anymore, and you need a miracle to turn the game around. Hoping your opponent blunders a piece, you start playing desperately. This has happened to absolutely all of us. And what we're going to try to learn, little by little, is how to be the ones who can do this to our opponents. When there are no obvious tactics, if we're able to play correctly, we'll put our opponent under pressure, and by the time they realize it, there will be nothing they can do. We're going to show this with a game by Bobby Fischer, one of this channel's favorite chess players, because he was a genius. Winning games when absolutely nothing seemed to be happening. This game was played against Ulf Andersson in 1970. Pay attention. e4, e5, nf3, and c6, and Fischer plays the Ruy Lopez opening, or Spanish opening, which we've explained many times on the channel. Friends, is there any opening we haven't covered on this channel? It's true that this opening is very popular, but the variation he used isn't as well known, so pay close attention. The game continues with a 6, perhaps the most popular move, along with nf6 against the Spanish opening. And here Fischer didn't play bishop a4, which is the main line, but instead used the exchange variation. Bishop takes c6. Let me explain the pros and cons of this variation, because it's important to know. Pros. The opponent's pawn structure is going to be worse. You can already see it, right? Double pawns. Only one central pawn, which is the king's pawn. White has the queen's pawn, but black doesn't, meaning a better pawn structure. In exchange for what? In exchange for the bishop pair for black. Enjoy this game. You'll probably want to watch it more than once because we're going to talk about some technical concepts, but it's really worth it. It's like being in a positional chess class. Those of us who love chess know that these videos are wonderful. Let's get started. This is where the game really begins, because up until now, these were just theoretical moves. Well, we've developed the knight and also the bishop, so now we can castle. At this point, after castling, black decides to defend this e5 pawn, which is completely hanging. Many of you have probably wondered, what happens if this pawn is captured? This is theoretical. In the Spanish opening, capturing this pawn is not a good idea, because after queen to d4, both the knight and the pawn are attacked. Black will get the pawn back, and on top of that, end up with a better position for their pieces. So here, white castles without any fear of the pawn being taken. Sorry, white castles without trying to take advantage of this loophole, this legal gap, so to speak, in the Spanish opening, which is capturing this e5 pawn. Now, with castling, white is actually threatening knight takes e5, because the rook would then be ready to come into the file and attack with a lot of force. That's why this pawn needs to be defended. Alright, there are several ways to defend it. In the game, f6 is played, a move praised by the engines. They say it's a very good move, but it doesn't really seem like the main one, right? The main moves would be bishop to d6, directly defending the pawn, or queen to d6, also defending this pawn, or even playing a bit more aggressively with bishop to g4, pinning the knight on f3 directly. In the game, f6 is played, which is also a very good move, but you have to be extremely strong to play it. Why is that? Because you're just moving pawns, while the player with the white pieces, in this case Fischer, is already castled and has developed pieces. So you have to be very careful. The game continues directly with d4. What's Fischer's idea? To break in the center in an obvious way. And this is a trick you can use in your own games. When you see that you're ahead of your opponents in development, in this case, it's obvious, right? Why is that? Because we have the knight out and we've already castled, while the opponent still has everything on the back rank. Let's break open the Saur. This is theoretical, okay? You can apply this no matter what the position is, as long as you have a development advantage. Why is that? Because now your opponent will have to focus on the central break, and we won't give them enough time to develop piece by piece. And now we need to consider whether to trade queens or not. Well, it seems just a bit better to keep the queens on the board, since we're the ones who have seized the initiative. Why do we want to keep the queens on the board? Because our opponent still hasn't developed anything and will have to waste time developing their pieces and castling the king. While they're losing that time, our queen can come in to attack the king. What move should be the best here for the black pieces? Well, if you've been paying attention to what I've said, c5 looks like a wonderful move because because it forces you to change, ladies. The knight must be removed if it is not lost, and then queen by queen, and the game would benefit the black pieces a little. Because these ladies wouldn't exist on the board. However, the move that uses a Zekin here is also very good. Horse is 7. However, be careful, okay? It's a move. A a bit slow, I'd say. Just a bit slow. Why? Because it prevents, or rather delays, the development of the dark squared bishop by blocking it. And even though this knight will quickly come out via g6, if we look at the next two moves, bishop to e3 and knight to g6, black is still behind in development. Careful, they have the pair of bishops. Let's not forget that. It might look like white is doing great, and they are, but in exchange, black has the bishop pair, which is always an advantage because they control all the squares on the board. Knight to d2, bishop to d6. Well, it's important to mention that this knight on d2 is important for two reasons. First, to jump to the c4 square, and second, because a knight on c3 could quickly get squeezed by the move bishop to d4. That's why knight to d2, and after bishop to d6, this knight jumps to c4. Look at how Bobby Fischer keeps improving his pieces non-stop. This is important. Castling. Now, it's true that black is pretty much fighting for equality and development, but white already has all their pieces developed, while black still has a bishop on its original square. So here, we already need to think about how to continue. A lot of people, and you mentioned this a lot in the comments, get stuck here. That is, they've developed all their pieces and castled, but don't know how to continue. All right, relax, it's simple. Now it's time for the major pieces, queens and rooks. First, where do we move this queen? We need to think about which square we like the most. We could consider e2. Well, that wouldn't be a bad idea, but then we stop defending this knight, which could easily be attacked later on. And my favorite is probably d3, right? The queen becomes very active, she can move along the third rank, she gets centralized in a spot that's not so easy to attack just with a knight and 5, and we can always swap her with our other knight, keeping our queen on d3, right? And something very important, a little trick for you, when you only have one bishop, try to place your queen on squares of a different color than your bishop. That way, the bishop controls, for example, in this case, the dark squares, and the queen controls the light squares. If you put both of them on dark squares, they get in each other's way a bit. It's true that there are situations where it's actually better to have both pieces on the same color, especially, for example, if you want to attack a fianchetto, then it would work in your favor. If we want to sacrifice the bishop on h6 so we can recapture with the queen, but in general, we always want to place the queen on a different color than the bishop. Knight to e5, just like we mentioned, attacks the queen, but luckily we have a knight on c4 that's very well placed, and can take care of eliminating this knight on e5 if we want to. And in fact, that's the best move, because if we move the queen away, it would be knight takes, queen takes, check, and the king has to go to h8. And probably after rook to e8 and bishop to e6, they would gain the initiative, and we'd be losing too much time. Therefore, in this case, it's better to capture. We gain the initiative because now they have to recapture no matter what, and we keep the queen on this great square that we want to hold for now. Flexible enough to give a check on c4 or b3 whenever we want. All right, here black has two options. Capture the knight with the pawn or capture it with the bishop, and only one of them's good. Okay, capturing with the pawn would be a mistake. Let's explain this clearly. If we capture with the pawn, besides ending up with an isolated pawn, which is usually a drawback in these kinds of positions because it blocks this bishop, there are no knights left, and we're basically heading into an endgame where the isolated pawn is always weaker. And above all, and most importantly, now the white pieces could respond. In a very simple way, for example, queen to b3, the king would have to move aside, and as soon as it does, we could simply continue, for instance, with knight to e6, attacking both the queen and the rook, forcing black to give up their good bishop. They'd have to give up their pair of bishops, and especially their good bishop. Why is it called a good bishop? Because the pawns are on dark squares, so the bishop that's on light squares will have much more freedom, so they have to give up the good bishop. Therefore, it wouldn't be a good idea. You get it, right? Capture with the pawn. Pretty interesting, huh? Probably, if we don't notice everything we've been explaining, we might think that capturing with the pawn is a good move. Therefore, here we realize that you should capture with the bishop. After bishop takes, we reach a position where black has the pair of bishops, as we've been seeing, and white has good development. But of course, you have to know how to take advantage of this dynamic advantage we have, because if not, they are going to end up surpassing us. So we need to attack. How can we attack? Well, for example, I noticed that the only piece we can attack is this bishop. Let's follow the logic, because all the others are still on the back rank, right? So how can we do it? Candidate moves. We could play knight to f3. Well, that doesn't seem like anything special to me. And the one I like the most, and I see Fisher does too, is f4. A direct move toward the only developed piece, gaining the initiative. Here, there are only two options, retreat the bishop or exchange it. It's clear that if you've been paying attention, the best thing for black seems to be to retreat it, right? Because otherwise, he'd be giving up his pair of bishops. And what was Fischer's idea? Now, to squeeze even more in Lasker's style, this f5 completely cuts off the good bishop. You see it? It's true that this just opened up the dark squared bishop and now it's aiming directly at our king side, but let's see why this doesn't worry us. Let's look at it now. But we are trapping the bishop on c8, which now has no available squares and can only go to d7. It won't be able to go to e6, and on this side it can't get out either because of its poor pawn structure. So what an interesting plan. f4 forces the bishop to retreat, and f5 cuts off this other bishop. After this queen to e7, as you can see, we're going to directly cut off the dark squared bishop with bishop to f4. That's why we didn't mind opening up this diagonal toward the h2 square. It's making sense, right? You can watch the game as many times as you need, because this lesson is really valuable. So let's see what black should do now. Letting it be captured, capturing, or moving the bishop away. Well, moving the bishop away doesn't seem like the best idea. Even though it looks like it's pinning the knight here, a move like c3 would probably reinforce things really well. The king could move aside, and the knight would be free again without any problem. And also, if the pawn is captured, you could recapture, and this central pawn mass would be really strong. The best move here, without a doubt, seems to be this one. Capturing this bishop on f4, the idea is that now white has to recapture and has, in quotes, lost to tempo with the rook, which can be taken advantage of, for example, by attacking it with the queen. In fact, first you play bishop to d7, the rook comes to d1, improving the rook. You see what Fischer's doing. There's no secret to it. Just putting pressure on the central pieces and improving his own pieces. Nothing more than that, without making things complicated. Very well, the rook is placed on the same file as the queen. Whenever this happens to you, it's better to move your queen because you never know. Later it might be too late and you'll end up in exactly the situation I explained at the beginning, right? In a situation where you end up lost, to keep things simple, the queen attacks us with a discovered attack, so we're going to move it, for example, to c5. The idea behind queen to c5 is clear. At some point, to block this queen, which can't move because if the queen leaves the attack, they'd lose the knight. However, for now, this doesn't worry Fischer too much, and he plays c3 to reinforce this knight. Understand that now this knight is pinned, and no matter how well it's defended, you could keep putting pressure on it, for example with the rooks. Therefore, sometimes it's much better to over-defend a piece before it's too late. Didepes? Exactly what I was telling you at the beginning of the game. Black continues with rook from a to a. They place themselves on the semi-open file. Rooks are always better on semi-open files. Of course, it would also be possible to move the rook from f to e8. In this case, the player with the black pieces thought it was better to move the rook from a to keep this rook on f, although surely the idea, I'll tell you in advance, is to double the rooks on the e file. So it doesn't really matter which rook you bring over here. And there's a saying that when I was a kid about 8 or 9 years old, a phrase from Kasparov really stuck with me. He said, listen up because sometimes you don't know which rook to bring to the center. What Kasparov said is, when you want to bring a rook to the center, do it with the other one. Impressive or not, because that way we usually minimize damage. That's what he said. But, well, it's up to each person to decide which rook they want to move. Alright, so what do we do now? Right. We're in a situation where all our pieces are well placed. I can't think of any to improve because they're all good, and I feel stuck. Well, if everything's set up, I'm going to attack. Here I go. G4. A move that might seem a little risky, right? We're leaving our king unprotected. But let's think about something. The only pieces that could come to attack are the bishop, which is completely blocked so it can't, and the queen, which can't do anything on her own because these rooks won't be able to come attack the king. So we're not worried, and we can launch an attack with total success. Queen to d6, which is attacking our rook. Simple, right? Well, I defend it with, for example, queen to g3. I could move the rook, that would also be a good idea. But I prefer queen to g3, putting pressure here at some point, or forcing this kind of pawn advance. And the queen could support them at some point, even with this h-pawn as well. Here, the German player prefers his plan of doubling rooks. It's clear that's a good idea since he only has one semi-open file. Free, because the D file is a bit, let's say, crowded by his own pieces, right? So he puts the rook on a7 to bring the other one to e8 and put pressure on the file. Pay attention to Fischer's plan. Knight to f3. Why? Well, it's very simple. I'll tell you right now. I made a dramatic pause, but I'll tell you right now. This knight on f3 is very well placed, supporting the advance of these two pawns. Do you see it? It's supporting us. So after the move c5, I understand that. So the knight can't return to this square here quickly. Fischer breaks toward the center with this e5. The knight is perfectly placed to break with the pawn on e5. The queen is attacked. Moving it wouldn't be a very good idea, because then we'd continue with pawn takes pawn. The rook is threatened, both by the pawn and by the rook. There's a threat here. So the best thing would be to capture. Alright, what do we capture with? With the knight or with the rook? With neither of them, my friends. You have to stay alert. If we capture with the knight or the rook, we lose a piece. You see that? Two pieces defending, two pieces attacking. It's not possible to capture this pawn, so what do we do? Did Fischer just hang a pawn? Well, no. You have to stay alert. The idea here is to place this rook and 4, and together with the two rooks, the knight, and the queen, a pawn is being threatened that's only defended by two pieces. It's impossible to defend this pawn. You could only defend it with one piece, and that wouldn't help at all. The game continues with bishop to c6, attacking the rook. Rook takes c5. The pawn has been recovered. The rooks are doubled because this rook is being threatened by two pieces. And now we're going to trade this rook. And now you'll see why. We remove pieces with the idea of not trading the other one just yet, but rather to place this knight in an even better position. Do you see how Bobby Fischer is constantly improving his pieces? What is black doing? So far, nothing, just defending. And what is white doing? Placing the pieces strategically so they come together for a strong attack. When we help our pieces, they'll help us in return. There's no need to force things too much. h6. Be careful. Whenever the pawns around your opponent's king move, you should be on high alert. Weaknesses and breaking points are being created. I'll say it again. Whenever the pawns around your opponent's king move, weaknesses and breaking points are being created. What are the weaknesses? The light squares. Why? Because both pawns are on dark squares, so we can take advantage of them. What are the breaking points? In this case, g5. Because this pawn is creating a breaking point on g5. So here, we need to take advantage of it directly. h4. This pawn here isn't doing anything, so we bring it into the attack as well. Along with the g-pawn, the f-pawn, and also the knight and queen, they're all going to come together for a very dangerous attack. Bishop to d7. Should we trade this knight for this bishop? Of course not. Which is better, this amazing steed planted on e5, or a bishop that can't do anything? Without a doubt, our knight is better, so we're not going to exchange it. We're going to keep improving our pieces. In this case, queen to f4, with the idea of supporting this point here and also backing up the f-file. Queen to f6, careful, they're attacking our h4 pawn. Can we capture this pawn right now, or would we be facing the threat of knight to g6 with a fork? We can capture it because if queen takes h4 and then knight to g6 with the fork, there would be queen takes e1 with check, an in-between move, and when the king moves away, then they could retreat the queen. So be careful, it's a real threat. Queen takes h4. What does Fischer do here? Pay attention, okay? Rook to e2, now there's no longer a threat of bishop takes h4 or queen takes h4. That would be a mistake. If queen takes h4 now, then knight to g6 with a fork, and they wouldn't have time to capture the rook because we've moved it away, so that would be a complete blunder. Also, not only would you win the exchange, but you'd win the entire rook. Follow me? Queen takes h4, knight to g6, the queen would have to move, and then there are two pieces attacking the rook, so it wouldn't be well defended, and you'd capture the whole rook. Both with the knight giving check and with the rook, and it would be an unavoidable mate in 8. If you want, you can look this up yourselves. I don't want to drag this out much longer. The game then continues with bishop to c8, and now this queen swings over to the other side to give a check. What's Fischer's idea here? To take this pawn? Not for now, but rather to control the white squares. And now he brings in this knight, giving check. So here it seems better, right? To move to the h7 square like this. No matter how much Fischer plays knight to g6, which he did, at least it's not check and he doesn't lose another tempo, right? And besides, if he lost another tempo, he'd lose the rook too, wouldn't he? So here, you're basically forced into this rook exchange on e2, aren't you? And Fischer ends up in a fantastic position. What do y'all think about this? Even though there aren't any obvious tactical details, Fischer's position is easy to squeeze. And let's take a look at this because it's really important. I'm sure a lot of you think, I'm able to get into good positions. Like this one, for example. But sometimes I'm not able to win them. And this, be careful, used to happen to me a lot in tournaments. If the tournament had 8 rounds, I would end up with a better position in all 8 rounds. And then I was only able to win 5 of them. How can that be? Because we need to work on converting advantages. Let's see how Fischer does it. In this case, after this move, bishop to d7, he starts with queen to e7. Just like you heard, forcing the exchange of queens. This queen has nowhere else to go. What? Leave? What? Trade this queen? And why exchange the queens if this looks like a totally equal endgame? 3 pawns versus 3 pawns, 2 pawns versus 4 pawns, this would mean total material equality. The idea is that this knight is better than this bishop. I'm going to give you this as another piece of advice. Wow, how many tips are you getting in just one lesson? This is amazing. Well, the idea is that in an endgame with just a bishop versus a knight, I always prefer to have the knight. A lot of people don't like this. This is just my opinion. Why? Because the knight can go to every square on the board. The bishop, for example, if it's on white squares, I can put all my pawns on black squares and you'll never be able to attack them. That's why I prefer having the knight over the bishop. Also, this 3 versus 2 on the queen side looks much stronger than this 4 versus 3, since these pawns are doubled and without the support of the king, it might be a bit harder for them to promote. Alright, let's see how Fischer did it. So black played this g5 to try to block this pawn majority on the king side, right? Well, pawn takes pawn and I secure a 2 versus 1 majority. For now, these connected pawns are extremely strong, because even if this pawn didn't exist, let's use our imagination and remove all the pieces and all the pawns except these two. The king is never going to be able to capture the pawn in the back, even if it's not defended. Why? Because as soon as he captures it, this pawn runs, and the king will never be able to catch it. For example, he captures, it advances, it gets there. You see it, right? So 2 connected pawns are extremely powerful. And that's why here, Fischer keeps these 2 connected pawns on g and f. The game continues like this. Knight to d5. We improve the knight while gaining initiative. We attack the c7 square, and even more importantly, do you see it? We threaten the double attack, knight to f6 check, and I take the bishop. So the important thing is to defend. This square right here. How? Well, for example, with bishop to c6, the bishop moves away while attacking the knight, so now it can't come here anymore. Of course, logically, we already win a pawn. An extra pawn? What does that mean? 3 against 3 equal here, and 2 against 1 advantage on the king side. Careful, because the bishop is coming to attack this square and it can't be defended. The great thing about the knight is that it has this magical triangulation. I love playing with knights, especially when I'm low on time. I handle them really well. And here Fischer does the same, knight to e8, defending this pawn. You can't take it because then comes knight to f6 check, and I take the bishop. From a distance, the knight triangulates and defends the g4 pawn. Look at how amazing that is. King to h6. Now this pawn is actually being threatened, but now I can simply come over and defend it. King to g7, and let. I have to move the knight and they're going to take my pawn. It's fine because I'm going to go on the attack. First you attack my knight, so I attack your bishop. If you take my knight, I'll take your bishop. The endgame is won, no doubt about it, because this 2 versus 1 will end up giving a huge advantage in queening a pawn without any problem. So what should black do? Move the bishop away, no question. So what do? Do I move the knight and let him take my pawn? Well, yes. Why? Because I move it while attacking another pawn. You see the difference? If you take me here, I'll take you there. And that's it. It's over, just like that. So, well, they move this pawn away, and I simply defend on g3 with the king. See? The way Fischer is playing, if you understand it, it's super simple and super effective. This pawn is defended, and as you can see, black can't do anything now. Fischer's next move is going to be knight to c5, attacking the b pawn, and if it moves, he'll take the a pawn. So that would already be 2 extra pawns. So here, the black player, Unziken, decided to resign the game, and it was a very good decision. At this point, it's probably a win. With a little more time, white would win, but at this level, among the best in the world, it's clear there's nothing left to do here. What did you think of this lesson, this game? Is it like it? Let me know in the comments if you want more games like this with commentary. What'd you think? If you want more games with white, with black, or if you prefer openings, what do you like? I love talking with you all. Talk to me, and you already know if you want to try out the app I use, I'll leave it for you, right down here below. I really like it because it has a lot of features, but the one I like the most is the opening study feature, since there are multiple lines and it's similar to my videos. So if you want, I'll leave it for you down here in the description. And stay tuned, friends, because soon I'm going to show you what I've prepared for all of you. I just can't hold it in any longer. I'm going crazy because I just can't wait any longer. I'm really excited. I hope you loved this video. Tomorrow we'll be back on the channel as always. If you want to try the app, you'll find it right below in the description. And as always, I'll see you tomorrow in the next video. Bye, friends.